Good evening. This is Pastor Mike from Leavittsburg Baptist Church, and this is our Wednesday night service for October 7th, 2020. Tonight, we're going to be looking at courageous faith. We'll be looking at Daniel chapter 3, so please turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. And have you ever wondered how these men of faith, men and women of faith, I should say, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, how they had the faith they had to do the things they did? How they had the faith to endure what they endured. Some might say that they had that faith because they expected God to save them all the time, to protect them, that they expected God to always prosper them in financially and physically. Some might say that they had that faith because they really didn't expect God to ever let anything truly bad happen to them. And yet we see horrible things happening to people of faith, both in the Bible and today as well, as we see churches and Christians persecuted around the world. During this COVID crisis, this COVID pandemic, we've seen people in America claim that the government is trying to shut the churches down, that the government is anti-church, and that may be true. I don't know. I can't really speak to that. I don't know the motivations of people's hearts. I know there is a spiritual conspiracy headed by the devil to do things, to minimize the church, to destroy the church. I don't necessarily know that there's a conscious effort, an Illuminati, so to speak, to do that. But there might be. I mean, I'm sure there are people. I know there are people out there that would like to shut down the church. But what we consider persecution in America is nothing compared to what people experience in Muslim countries and countries that are controlled by drug lords, where Christians are murdered, raped, tortured, beaten, imprisoned without due cause and without just cause and without due process. And we see this, and they remain faithful, and we ask, how can they do that? I mean, some of these Christians have remained faithful for years under torture and imprisonment, and yet we see military in the past who have been trained to endure hardship, and they get captured by the enemy, and some have been broken by the enemy to say or do whatever the enemy wants them to do. And they're trained for this, and yet most Christians aren't really trained for that in the classical sense. And how do they do it? How do they have this courageous faith? I think we find the answer in Daniel chapter 3. So open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to look at Daniel chapter 3 and see what it has to say. So beginning at verse 1, says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image out of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set upon it upon the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed aloud, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of a horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, that you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And so what we see here is a new take on the same old religion. It's idolatry. It's just pure idolatry. And not only that, but it's really a more intense expectation. It's a more intense expectation of this idolatry. And that is because he's saying, when you hear music from these instruments or any other instruments, you need to bow down and worship or else. I mean, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. You think about the economic impact of something like that would have on a nation. I mean, how much music do we have? And we maybe have more music today than they did back then, but countries for millennia have had street performance, people playing instruments, and every time an instrument would play, they would have to bow down. What's that going to do to business? And so this is something, I don't know if Nebuchadnezzar really thought this through, but he was a king and he was wealthy, and he didn't necessarily care about his people as much as a king should. He wasn't always looking out for their best interest. Some wonder if this golden image was an image of him, and it could have been. It's possible that he was setting himself up as God, or to be ascended to godhood. That's a possibility. The Bible doesn't really tell us. I know we get some crazy ideas from things. I remember when I was a kid, I saw pictures of this idol, and it looked like Nebuchadnezzar, but at the bottom of this idol was a fiery furnace, and some have depicted it as being a statue, and inside that statue was this fiery furnace. I doubt that that's true, simply because gold is not going to hold up to extreme heat particularly well. And so, but this was a really serious thing, because if people didn't bow down, they're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so what we see then is that the Chaldeans really had a malicious plan that they were going to partake in. It says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So I want to point out that this malicious plan they had, it was really set out to destroy the Jews. And so they made this accusation, and the accusation was specifically an accusation that targeted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego specifically. You might ask, well, what about Daniel? Why was Daniel bowing down? They didn't bring up Daniel. Well, it's possible that Daniel was too influential and too powerful. They didn't want to go up against him. It's possible that his position, his position was not one of those positions that was required to bow down. I mean, there's a lot of positions that had to bow down, but the king didn't name himself, and it's possible that he didn't name Daniel either. So his position could have been an exception. He could have been traveling. There's any number of reasons why Daniel does not appear in this passage. But what I am confident of is that Daniel, if he'd been there, he did not bow down. The question I do have, though, is how did these guys know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow down? Because if they were bowing down, they wouldn't have been able to see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They kind of tattled on themselves here, because if the king were thinking straight, he would have realized you couldn't know if they bowed down if you were bowing down. But they really worded this in such a way that they really misrepresented Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and what they were doing and what their intention was. Take a look. They use this phrase, they pay no attention to you. Now, that phrase is very telling. That phrase is a phrase that really they were saying, they're not paying attention to you, king. It gives the impression that they're off doing their own thing without any regard for what the king thinks, without any regard for who he is, of his position, without any respect for him. If you want to lose your job, doesn't matter what your job is. If you want to lose your job, ignore your boss. That's a great way to lose your job. Just decide that I know better than everyone else, and I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. That's the impression that these Chaldeans were giving of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so this really enraged Nebuchadnezzar. When we look at this, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace, and who is a God who will deliver you out of my hand? And so, the Chaldeans just really did a job on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. And they pointed him out. Their plan worked. That's important to note. They wanted to destroy the Jews. They made the accusation, and it worked. Nebuchadnezzar became enraged, and then what we see next is Nebuchadnezzar starts to question the Jews. He starts questioning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he warns them. He says, listen, is it true that this is the case? Nebuchadnezzar knows these men. I don't know how well he knows them, but certainly Daniel's recommendation meant a lot. It carried a lot of clout, and so he would have a high expectation of these men. And so he would have been shocked that they're not being obedient to him, that they're not submitting to his authority. And so he asked them, is it true that you won't bow down? He questions them that, and then he warns them. He says, if you will not bow down, you'll be thrown in the fiery furnace. And I want to point out that Nebuchadnezzar really demonstrates his arrogance before God. He says, but if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Here's the arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar. He's kind of setting himself up as God. He said, I'm so powerful, you can't stop me. That happens a lot in our society. It happens a lot around the world where somebody gains so much power, so much authority, so much influence, they think they're untouchable. It's not just authority figures. We see that with actors and actresses. We see that with musicians, people who are stars. They think they can do anything and get away with anything, and sometimes they do. You have to ask yourself, why do some of these stars who are making millions of dollars, why do they have to go somewhere and shoplift? Why do they think they can drive drunk and then attack a police officer and cuss him out when he pulls them over and threaten their job because of who they are? That's kind of the mindset that Nebuchadnezzar has. He thinks he's greater than God. He thinks that there's no God, there's no one who can deliver them. And so it's a very arrogant position. And honestly, it's really quite gracious of God not to have just struck him down right there. But our God is a God of patience, and he's a God of grace, and he's a God of mercy. And so what we see is next is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's courageous faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us out from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. I want to point out that, first of all, they answer him directly, but not rudely. sometimes as Christians we take our position, and we even take a right position, but we present ourselves in such an arrogant and rude way that nobody's willing to take the time to listen and to hear the argument against whatever they're doing. And so they show him respect. They call him, "O Nebuchadnezzar." They call him "O King," and that "O King" is a very respectful term. They're showing him deference, even though they're not willing to bow down before him. They're not willing to obey the law that he has set up. But look at their courage. He says, "Our God is able to protect us. We believe He will save us from your hand. He's going to protect us, deliver us out of your hand. But even if He doesn't, we will not worship this idol that you've set up." And what an amazing faith that is. And so Nebuchadnezzar really he kind of blows his top here. Look at what it says here. It says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar," in verse 19, "was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times more than it was heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace, because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace." Look at this. It says these men, they're thrown into the furnace. They're called to be thrown in the furnace. He gets some of the strongest men in his army to bind these men in their clothing and throw them into this furnace. The furnace is heated 7 times hotter than a normal furnace. Now, I did some research, and a typical wood-burning furnace, that flame in there, gets up to about 1,400, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. A coal-burning furnace will get up to 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. You heat that up, do the math, you heat that up 7 times hotter than it's been. And some people say, well, that's just figure, that's just kind of like saying, I've told you this a million times. But I don't believe God lies. When he says he ordered it heated up 7 times, they heated it up 7 times. And so this flame was so hot that it killed these strong men. I want you to know that if you heat a wood-burning furnace 7 times hotter, or a coal-burning furnace 7 times hotter, that wood-burning furnace approaches the heat of the photosphere of the sun, the outer surface of the sun. That coal-burning furnace exceeds the heat of the surface of the sun. So you can see how it would kill these men. And then as these men went to throw them in, they were slain, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the burning fiery furnace. And that had to have been an amazing thing for Nebuchadnezzar to see these strong men fall dead. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego falling into that furnace. Take a look here. It says, Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose in haste, and he declared his counselor, this is God's amazing grace here. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near and to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. I want you to think about this for a minute. What this grace that God has demonstrated to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what it really means here. First of all, the king, he's amazed by what he sees as these men fall dead, and these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into the furnace. And he goes to that furnace and he looks into it. Now, think about this. The furnace was so hot that it killed the strong men. And yet God in his grace preserves Nebuchadnezzar's life as he goes to that furnace to look down into it, because it appears to be something that maybe was in the ground. And he looked down into it, and he's unaffected by it. But what he sees is he sees four men. He sees four people standing in that, not just standing in that furnace, but they're up and walking around. And he says the fourth one is like a son of the gods. Look at God's grace as he protected them. First of all, they were alive. Second of all, they were free. The bonds had been burned away. Third, he did not leave them alone. Jesus tells us he will never leave us nor forsake us. If we feel alone, it's only a feeling. He loves us. And then fourthly, they were unharmed, both unharmed and untouched by the flame. I mean, think about that God not only freed them, but he said this is fourth person. He's like a son of the gods. And who is that? I believe it's a pre-incarnate Christ. That Jesus Christ came down and comforted them as they're in this flame. They needed to be calm. Think about it. If you were to be somewhere and all of a sudden you were engulfed in flame, there's flames everywhere. There's no escape. And even if you're unharmed, it would be a frightening experience. I believe that was Jesus. The King James, I like the way it calls it. He says he looks like a son, the Son of God. And I do believe that that's the pre-incarnate Christ. And so we see God's grace in protecting these three Hebrew men. We see God's grace really in protecting Nebuchadnezzar as he goes to the edge to look down and see these men free and safe and walking around. They got them out of the furnace. Their hair was not singed. I mean, hair is so easy to singe, and their clothes weren't burned at all, and they didn't even have the smell of fire or smell of smoke on them. This fire literally didn't touch them. And what amazing thing that is. And I believe really that this was an important day for Nebuchadnezzar. As important as it was for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as important it was for us to see their faith and how their courageous faith worked out for them. I believe that it was an important day for Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps even more important than we believe, because I really believe that Nebuchadnezzar has a new faith now. Look at what it says, verse 28 through the end of the chapter. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies, rather than to serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruin. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So take a look at what this means. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar gave God the glory. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to cover up the facts. He didn't try to spin things his way. He just said, "Give God the glory. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants." And then he acknowledges their faith, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. He said, this is an amazing faith. They sacrificed their bodies just so they wouldn't have to worship another god. It's really kind of a foreign concept to Nebuchadnezzar because these people, other than the Jews, these idolaters, they didn't have just one god. They'd have a lot of gods. And so it wasn't really necessarily considered a big deal to worship multiple gods. And yet they said, no, we have one God. And we're serving him. And we're being faithful to him. And so he says this. He puts his faith in the one true God. I believe we see that here. And we're going to see more of that next week. But take a look. He says, therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. I really see this as a moment of faith for Nebuchadnezzar in trusting God. I believe that Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven this day. That he died. When he died, he went to heaven. And you say, well, he was a pagan king. He was an idolater. Yes, he was. He was an idolater. And quite frankly, so were we. And does he still commit idolatry? Yeah, we're going to see that in chapter 4, that he idolized himself. But don't we do the same thing, and yet we don't ever really doubt our faith? Here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he is saying, I'm going to defend this faith to the ultimate degree. He's going to destroy anyone who says anything bad about God. I question whether anyone who is not a child of God would do that. And then he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You say, well, what's the secret of this courageous faith, Mike? What is it? Because you haven't really said it. Well, I believe the secret of courageous faith is this, that their faith, it wasn't based on God protecting them, though they expected him to protect them. It wasn't based on God prospering them, though they probably did live a quite comfortable life. They left it open that God wouldn't protect them, that he might take everything away from them, that he might not save them. And yet they served in many ways, and I believe they served in many ways because they believed, they understood that our God is a sovereign God who only allows things in our lives that are going to help us. Sometimes there are good things that he allows into our life that help us. Sometimes there are things that we don't like. There are disciplines that are put in our lives to protect us. And yet he does that because he's a sovereign God, and he's going to bring about his plan. And if you really want to see the evidence that I believe proves that Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven, that he trusted God, that he trusted Christ, the coming Christ, as his Savior. If you want to see that proof, I encourage you to be here again next Wednesday as we look at Daniel chapter 4. And when we look at Daniel chapter 4, I believe there is insurmountable evidence that Nebuchadnezzar is a holy man of God, in spite of his sin, in spite of all that he's done. So I encourage you to be here next Wednesday night. I hope you'll be at church on Sunday. We have 2 baptisms, and I hope you'll share in that. May God richly bless you as you serve him.